When it comes to financial wealth, there is a massive racial gap in the United States of America between black and brown people and white people. Now, very often, home ownership is cited as both a problem and a potential solution to fixing this wealth gap. Well, in this video, which is part one of our 3-part series on closing the black racial wealth gap, we will look at the connection between home ownership and the black racial wealth gap. We'll specifically look at historic and present systemic barriers that are preventing equitable home ownership, and we will look at how dismantling them will not only allow more families to build wealth through home ownership, but also allow them to secure their financial futures. There you have it. Let's fasten our seatbelts, let's dive in, and let's get to work. Hello, AfriKili family and Global PAC Nation. It is hard to believe. It has already been 2 years since I launched this AfriKili channel. Now, even though I've not been able to bring you videos on a consistent basis, I am very, very thankful that so many of you are sending messages expressing your appreciation for our content. So I wanted to take the time to acknowledge every one of you that support us and every one of you that decide and choose to spend time with us whenever we're able to post a new video. So thank you very much. But I also wanted to ask you a very simple and small favor. You see, for the last few months, I've been working very hard to improve the quality of our content. So you can expect that we'll be bringing you more videos on a consistent basis, and we'll be bringing you very interesting guests. So if you appreciate this channel, and if you've ever liked any of our videos, the very simple and free favor I'm asking of you is to hit the subscribe button. You see, by subscribing, not only will you help this channel grow, but you will help bring you the highest quality guests. Now, that being said, as you're about to watch, I hope you'll enjoy this latest AfriKili video where we build bridges in the global PAC, the global Pan-African community. Thank you very much. Hello, AfriKili family and Global PAC Nation. Most people would agree that there are different types of wealth, and defining them can be very subjective. However, when it comes to financial wealth, we can usually define and measure them objectively by using monetary instruments such as currencies, securities, and different forms of properties. Well, by using some of these instruments, Mansa Musa, who's the 14th century black African ruler from the Mali Empire, is considered to be the richest man who has ever lived. Unfortunately, today, in present times, black people in Africa and the global Pan-African diaspora are less financially wealthy compared to other racial groups. If we look specifically at the United States of America, the racial wealth gap represents one of the most persistent and significant socioeconomic disparities, with black Americans disproportionately affected. There are several factors deeply rooted in historical injustices and structural inequalities that have caused and sustained this enduring gap. This is evident when it comes to home ownership, a critical component of wealth accumulation. So throughout this video, we'll specifically delve into the inseparable connection between home ownership and the racial wealth gap in the United States by exploring the historical context, systemic barriers, and potential solutions. So what exactly is the black racial wealth gap, and how big is it? Well, in the United States of America, the racial wealth gap is simply the difference in wealth between white households and black and Latino households. To determine it, we just have to measure the median differences in wealth of white versus that of black Americans and Latinos. Unfortunately, over the last 4 decades, the racial wealth inequality gap has grown and continued to grow. According to a 2019 report from the Federal Reserve, the median wealth of white families was approximately $188,200 compared to just $24,100 for black families. Now, this means that on average, white households possess almost 10 times more wealth than that of black households. You might still be wondering, what is the connection between home ownership and this racial wealth gap? Let's examine that. Well, in the United States of America, there also happens to be a massive difference between black and white households that own homes. Now, this difference in percentage is known as the black and white home ownership gap. If we look at the US Census Bureau, about 75% of white households own their homes compared to just 46% of black households. This massive home ownership gap is both a cause and a consequence of the broader racial wealth gap because a very significant portion of American wealth is composed of home equity. Consequently, the home ownership disparity directly affects wealth building opportunities as home ownership is a key avenue for asset accumulation. Now, in addition to building equity, home ownership also allows families to benefit from things such as tax advantages and then pass the wealth down to future generations. It follows that the low home ownership rates among black families means fewer opportunities to leverage these benefits, which in turn perpetuates the cycle of wealth disparities. To put it simply, higher home ownership rates among white families translate to greater wealth accumulation over time. You might wonder, what about neighborhoods with predominantly black homeowners? Well, families that are able to become homeowners in black neighborhoods also face significant housing valuation disparities. You see, homes in predominantly black neighborhoods are valued at an average of $48,000 less than homes in predominantly white neighborhoods. Cumulatively, this results in a staggering loss of equity for black homeowners, which is estimated at approximately $156 billion. It is worth noting that the lack of home ownership also limits opportunities for business development because entrepreneurs often are able to use home equity to start businesses. We should know that this black racial wealth gap is deeply rooted in systemic racism in the United States of America. The origins can be traced back to the era of slavery, which was followed by a long period of systemic discrimination through the Jim Crow laws, segregation, and discriminatory policies. Now, one of the most impactful periods was the mid-20th centuries when policies like the New Deal, the GI Bills, provided unprecedented opportunities for home ownership and wealth building, but primarily among white Americans. Because these policies largely excluded black Americans who were systematically denied access to mortgages and affordable housing. The practice of redlining was one of the most notorious racist practices against potential black homeowners. In case you've never heard about it, redlining was a discriminatory practice that emerged in the 20th century and systematically denied loans and services to residents of certain neighborhoods based on race or ethnicity. Now, this redlining practice effectively denied wealth accumulation opportunities to black families by restricting their access to credit, to mortgage, and insurance. As a result, black families were denied many opportunities to build wealth through home equity. In our present time, there are several factors such as income disparities and home appraisal bias that continue to worsen the home ownership gap and by extension, the racial wealth gap. Black households typically have lower average incomes than white households, limiting their ability to save for down payments or afford mortgages. Additionally, black families often face more stringent credit criteria and higher interest rates, making home ownership more expensive and less accessible. When it comes to appraisal bias, it also hinders wealth accumulation through home ownership because homes in predominantly black neighborhoods are frequently appraised at lower values than similar homes in white neighborhoods. This devaluation reduces the potential for building significant home equity, further limiting wealth accumulation for black homeowners. Now, we should recognize that over the years, a few policies have tried to address these disparities. For example, you have the Fair Housing Act of 1968 that was designed to eliminate discrimination in housing, but its enforcement has been inconsistent. And more recently, affordable housing initiatives and down payment assistance programs have tried to reduce barriers to homeownership for black families. However, the impact of these programs has been mixed and significant challenges remain. And even more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic aggravated existing disparities, with Black families experiencing higher rates of job loss and economic instability, which further hindered their abilities to buy and maintain homes. Additionally, you have trends like gentrification in urban areas that are displacing long-term Black residents, reducing their ability to benefit from rising property values. Ultimately, the racial wealth gap and homeownership disparity will not be adequately addressed without a multifaceted approach. I believe that solutions should include at least one, if not all, of the following elements. 1. Policy reforms. 2. Economic development. 3. Education and counseling. 4. Affordable housing initiatives. And 5. Reform the credit scoring systems. Now, let me expand these 5 elements very briefly. 1. Policy reform. Well, I believe that policymakers should strengthen fair housing laws and increase funding for affordable housing. Also, we should implement policies to prevent displacement due to gentrification and aggressively address discriminatory lending practices, which can be very, very detrimental. 2. Economic development. I believe that intentionally supporting economic development in predominantly Black neighborhoods can increase property values and create more ownership opportunities. 3. Education and counseling. See, many organizations are already working very hard to empower potential minority buyers with knowledge about the home ownership process. But I believe that we should increase this effort by providing more financial literacy education and home ownership counseling. 4. Affordable housing initiatives. Our policymakers should incentivize public-private partnerships to develop more affordable housing units and increase funding for affordable housing programs such as down payment assistance. And 5. Reform the credit scoring system. See, there are inherent biases built into the traditional credit scoring system. So I think that we need to reduce reliance on credit scores for mortgage approvals and explore alternative credit scoring models that consider factors beyond traditional credit history. Let me do a quick recap as I'm concluding this video. I have established that in the United States of America, the Black racial wealth gap and home ownership disparities are deeply intertwined and rooted in both historical and systemic inequities. Bridging this gap requires concerted efforts across policy, community development, and individual support if we are to create equitable opportunities for wealth building through home ownership. By dismantling systemic barriers and promoting equitable home ownership, we can work towards a more just and equitable societies where all families have a fair shot at building wealth through home ownership, but also securing their financial futures. Next time, in our second video of this 3-part series on closing the Black racial wealth gap, we will look at connections between the Black racial wealth gap and education. And then in our third and final video of this series, we will conclude by exploring different ways to reduce the Black racial wealth gap. We will see how by building bridges in the global Pan-African community, we can have tremendous opportunities to build financial wealth, both in mature economies such as the United States of America, but also in emerging markets such as Africa and the Caribbean. I will close this video with a quote from Booker T. Washington, one of the leading African American intellectuals of the 19th century and the founder of both the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute in 1881, which today is called the Tuskegee University, and the National Negro Business League. His quote says, "Associate yourself with people of good quality, for it is better to be alone than to be in bad company." The AfriKili family and Global PAC Nation, there are people of good quality across the global Pan-African diaspora and community. Let us associate and build bridges in order to create powerful coalitions that will span continents and generations. Until next time, peace be with you. AfriKili, African intelligence to build bridges in the global Pan-African community. Asante sana, let's get to work.